Hi everyone, my name is Kiana. I'm on the Adj Corps for the Panamanian Championships, and I'm here to give you a seminar on electoral systems, political systems, and debate. So I'll talk a little bit about myself, why I think this is an interesting seminar, and how I think it's applicable. Then I'll give you a quick overview of what I'm hoping you'll all learn from this, and then the plan of action and what we'll be talking about. Before I start, I just wanted to apologize that I couldn't do this live. Unfortunately, my class, or I took a different class than I expected, so I was no longer free at the time that this was supposed to be live. Okay, so first a little bit about myself. My name's Kiana, I'm from Canada. I've been debating for too many years, but I'm very interested in electoral systems and electoral reform, as well as in politics in general. I'm currently a law student at McGill University, and before that I had a background in philosophy and in biology. So the reason why I thought this would be an interesting thing to talk about is because I think that oftentimes electoral systems influence the political arguments that we make in a debate round, whether we're aware of it or not. And they also allow us to make a little bit more nuanced arguments that are more likely to win us rounds or seem a little bit more elaborate than what we might first think a debate topic is about. I also think that especially now that there are more online tournaments where tournaments are hosted by different countries or in different places, where there are people from different places that you might not know a lot about, understanding the basics of electoral systems and political systems, and how the words people use might be different, or the systems they're coming from might be different, is really helpful to make sure that you're able to engage with a variety of argumentation and in a variety of places. Okay, so in terms of the main goals of this seminar, I want people to be able to understand the main different electoral systems that exist and how they might affect arguments about politics or electoral strategy. I also want people to be able to understand potential political divides and the policy implications and how that also varies depending on the country that you're talking about. And then I'm going to relate it a little bit more explicitly back to common debate topics and how it can deepen your analysis in many political rounds, even ones that aren't explicitly about electoral systems or political systems. So that's a bit of the structure of what I'm going to talk about. I'm actually going to talk about quite a bit of different electoral systems. The goal isn't for you to know the nitty-gritty of each topic, but more just to give you an overview of what exists and the different types of problems or benefits that come with different systems. Okay, so this is just a picture I got off Wikipedia. I thought it gave a good overview of the different systems of government that exist. So as you can see, in terms of democratic governance structures, there are basically two different types of governance structures: Republican forms, which is basically just having a president, or monarchical forms, which is having a monarch. So not all of these subsections are necessarily democratic, and there will always be debates about how democratic even any individual country is. This is mostly just to give you an overview of how they are structured, because they do influence who matters when you're doing political debates, or who is likely to be talked about. So if you are talking about a presidential republic, where the executive president is separate from the legislature, they often have a lot more power and influence over decisions because they're in control of the executive. Whereas if you have a parliamentary republic, the president would be quite ceremonial and actually wouldn't have a lot of tangible power. So when you're looking at a country that you might not know a lot about, it's not enough to look, does this person have a president? Does this country have a president or not? It's what is the actual role of that president and how much power do they concretely have? A similar thing would be said for prime ministers, right? Some prime ministers might have a lot more influence and impact than other ones. Similarly for monarchical forms of government, obviously there are absolute monarchies where the monarch heads the executive. That can mean that they have quite a bit of power, but having a monarchy doesn't automatically mean that the monarch is the most powerful executive actor in that country. So a lot of constitutional monarchies have a ceremonial monarch who might officially be head of the executive, but probably actually makes very little of the actual decision making, or they might have more influence. So that can vary a lot. Okay, in terms of legislatures, which are just the groups of people who make a lot of the laws and decision making in terms of budgets and other things, there are two main structures for legislatures. So one is multicameral or bicameral, which just means there's more than one legislature, or unicameral, which means there's only one. So the only thing I want to flag here is that both exist. Multicameral ones are more common in bigger countries or countries that have a lot of ethnic differences or regional differences. And usually it means they have what we call an upper and lower house, though for all of the terms I use, the terms can vary a lot depending on what country you're talking about. So I try to use a couple different terms so that you get used to different ways they might be referred to, but that's just the general idea. So usually then why they have multiple legislatures, usually two, is because they will be selected in different ways that have slightly different roles in society. So if you look at what a lot of countries have that is influenced by the United Kingdom, is they will have one house that is elected in whatever the kind of main system is in that country. And then the other house might be appointed in certain ways, or they're elected in a way that reflects a different thing than what the lower house reflected. So where I'm from in Canada, the Senate, which is the upper house, is still appointed. So the Prime Minister basically selects who it sits on the Senate. So it'll often be based on kind of political leanings, although that has changed recently. So that's the case in a lot of countries. In other countries, they might be elected based on region. So even in Canada where they're appointed, they still have to be appointed in regionally representative places. So if you think about the United States, they have 2 senators per state, no matter what size the state is. So whether that state has 1 million people or 30 million people, they have 2 senators. So you can see very clearly there that the goal of that is not to represent the population in a proportional way, but to represent different regions. And oftentimes, or most of the time, you need the approval of both houses or both legislatures, or the legislature and the Senate, to be able to pass a bill or a law, etc. Which means that you're trying to take into account the ethnic or regional differences as well as kind of a more proportional thing. Okay, now to get into what I think is a little bit more interesting and probably more novel for a lot of people is electoral systems. So most people are aware generally of the way the electoral system works in their country, but often don't think about the ways that other countries may have very different electoral systems. So this is a useful thing to look up if you're debating online at a tournament that's hosted by a different country. Just look up what their electoral system is, just to kind of have an idea if it's similar to yours or very different. So this again is just kind of an overview. It's not about learning all of the different types or what countries they apply to. It's just to show you that there's a lot of variety. And I'm going to go over a few kind of key ones and talk about what they look like and what kind of issues come up in those countries. So the first one is what's called plurality, or winner takes all. It's also called first past the post. So this structure basically just means that you don't need a majority of votes to win a specific election. You just need a plurality, so you need more than the other people had. So for example, if you are running in a specific area, which is often called a district, or in other places called a riding, if you're running for office in that area, you don't need 50% plus 1 of the vote to win that area. You need more than the other people who are running in that area. So if you have 3 political parties, the blue party, the red party, and the green party, if the blue party gets 40% of the vote and the other 2 parties get 30% each, then the blue party will win, right? They don't need to have 50%, they just need more than the other people. So oftentimes the way this works is in elections in which there are multiple districts or ridings, each individual would work that way. So as you can imagine, that can cause quite a bit of distortion when you put together all of the different districts that exist. So if every district is picking one person to represent a political party, and the blue party gets 40% of the vote in all of the ridings, even if most people didn't like the blue party and voted for someone else, in theory, the blue party could have every seat, right? So that's a pretty interesting dynamic because there can be quite a bit of distortion between popular support and the number of seats or politicians who are actually elected to represent a given party. Usually it's not that clear cut, but there is usually a distortion in terms of the popular vote percentage and the percentage of representatives who are elected for a given party. Another criticism that is brought about in this electoral system is the criticism that it encourages a lot of tactical and strategic voting. So I want to flag that there are kind of two issues here, especially when you think about the United States. In countries that are effectively two-party systems, so when there are two really dominant political parties, and it's really hard for other political parties to break in, this becomes an issue almost no matter what, right? Because people feel like they don't really have a choice between other parties. They have to pick the lesser of two evils all the time. So they're usually voting strategic in the way that they're voting for the party they like the least instead of the party that they really like. But this also happens when plurality voting happens, because if you really don't like one party, you're probably going to try to vote for the party that is closest to it percentage-wise in your given district, as opposed to the party that you really like, who might be doing a little bit less well in your district. But also because of something that's called vote splitting, which is if you have two parties that are similar or that have support among similar groups of people, so two parties who really care about the environment, for example, people might split up their vote between those two, and the party that might have less support overall could break through and win that district, even if most people don't like that party. So if the Green Party and the Blue Party each have 30% of the vote, if they came together, they'd have 60%, but the Red Party might beat them because they have 40 and the other two now have 30. So vote splitting is a really big problem in a lot of these systems, and that also encourages people to vote strategically for the party they think is more likely to succeed. Obviously, there's a question of how well people vote strategically and how informed they are. So for example, a lot of people who might not understand their political system well might say, well, the Blue Party has 35% support nationally, so I'm going to vote for them so the Reds don't win in my district. But it could be that actually in their district, the Green Party is doing a lot better. So they accidentally split the vote while trying to vote strategically. So there's also a question of how informed people are and how good they are at making decisions, even if they're trying to vote strategically under the system. Another term that you might hear a lot, especially if you're debating in the United States or about the United States, is the term gerrymandering, which is basically when usually the government that's in power does or creates districts in ways that favor their political party, either based on the demographics who tend to support them, etc. So that's pretty easy to do with plurality voting, because you can imagine if there's a certain number of districts, if you cut them one way, maybe the Blue Party gets 40%, 40%, 40% and wins all three ridings. Whereas if it's cut a different way, maybe they'll get 60% in one riding and then less, and then they'll only win one riding or two instead of three. So that's something that can happen if the people who are deciding what the districts look like are politically motivated themselves. That's why many countries have somewhat, or there's obviously variation, but independent bodies that make the decision for what the districts look like based on demographics or the area or whatever it is, to try to limit that political effect. The last thing I want to flag in this context then is what's called a safe seat, or safe district, or safe riding, or whatever word you would use, which basically just means that there may be some areas in which the person is very confident that they will always win plurality, even if they don't win a majority. So that can affect the degree to which politicians actually make an effort to represent their constituents, how much they're influenced by their constituents, how much they're influenced by, say, protests or petitions or other things, if they think that they're pretty safe because there's vote splitting or because they're the one prominent party in an otherwise split area, etc. This can also be a concern in other systems, but it's particularly discussed in this one, in which there is a lot of strategic voting as well. Okay, so the other system, which is more prominent in presidential elections as opposed to parliamentary or legislature elections, is what's called the two-round system or runoff voting. So this just means that you have a first round of elections where you would have kind of everyone who wants to run for president, for example, often representing political parties, but not necessarily. And the two top people from the first round of the vote would go head to head, and people would only choose between them for the second round of the vote. So the advantage then is people feel kind of a little bit more open to vote for who they really support in the first round, and then can kind of strategically vote between who they dislike less in the second round. In theory, also the first round could have a different system other than plurality to decide who the top two are. The problem with this is there's still probably issues of splitting the vote in the first round. So if you have 2 or 3 candidates who have very similar platforms, they could split the vote, and 2 more prominent candidates who had very different opinions could be top 2, even if a bigger chunk of people supported kind of these 3 politicians there. So there's still issues of vote splitting, but it is one approach that kind of deters the worst version of vote splitting, if that makes sense. So another system is ranked choice voting. This is where you just rank your choices 1, 2, 3, 4. It occurs a little bit differently depending on if you're electing, say, one person, so a president, or if you're trying to elect an entire parliament. So I think that part is pretty intuitive. A few things to flag is that it can still be distorting in the fact that if you're doing a ranked vote in every district, you probably aren't able to really capture or reflect the popular vote that well in a similar way that happens with plurality voting. There's also a lot of discussion about how much it kind of moderates, for better or for worse, people's opinions. So if you are in kind of a country in which there's a traditional left-right spectrum, everybody's or most people's second choice is probably the centrist party. So you would disproportionately select them instead of having a variety of opinions represented in, say, your parliament. There's a second version of this ranked choice voting that's called single transferable vote that tries to be a little bit more proportional. So the way that it works is basically that you would have a district or riding that has multiple representatives in it. So for example, if you have a district that has 3 representatives, it would be the 3 people who get closest to 30% of the vote first would each get a seat. Or if one person gets 60%, another gets 30%, the first party would get 2 seats and the second one would get first. So it's a little bit more reflective of the nuances of the popular support, as opposed to being still winner takes all at the end of the day. So the last one, which is quite different, is proportional representation, list proportional representation, which I think is probably the most intuitive one. So it's just basically just reflects the popular vote. You would have a list that's either determined by the political party, so a closed list of the candidates. Voters could vote for that list, or it's like district lists, so local lists of candidates. And basically, you would vote for the party or a candidate associated with that party. And the percentage of votes that the party gets is the percentage of seats they get and the percentage of candidates that they appoint. So if I'm a political party, I have my list of people, the first 50 get elected, so those are the first 50 who go and sit. There are also ways to mix it with other systems that I won't quite get into. So the last form I wanted to talk about is called mixed member proportional representation. And it basically tries to keep more district accountable representation. So one problem with list proportional representation, especially if it's a closed list, so the party decides, is it's hard to keep individual people accountable in the same way as if they're representing a specific district who can vote them out or vote them in. Is that mixed member proportional still has a district vote for an individual candidate. The difference is that they also vote for a party. So they have two votes. One, which is the party vote, will be what is considered the popular vote at the end of the day. So red party got 40%, blue party got 30, green party got 30. But the candidate vote would be people just voting for whatever candidate they prefer. And it can be from the same party or from a different party. So the candidate in the district who has the most supports, this can be either a plurality vote or a ranked vote. The one who has the most support would become the representative for that district and have a seat in parliament. There would then be a group of seats that are what we call top-up seats. So they would stay empty as the election occurs. And at the end, you would put politicians from the parties that had a disparity between the popular vote and the number of seats they currently have. So remember what I was saying before in terms of how if the blue party gets 40% of the vote in every district, they could technically have all of the seats or almost all of the seats in the district. So if the blue party got 30% of the vote, you would give the blue party these additional top-up seats to make the overall parliament more reflective of the popular vote. So it's not a perfect system, but it tries to get more into a reflection of the popular vote while still having local district elections. So one thing to flag for this, which is also the case for proportional representation, is that you tend to have way less majority governments. So you very rarely would have a party that has over 50% of seats or 50% of representatives in their legislature. So you usually need to form coalitions with other governments or agreements with other governments, whether informal or formal, to keep your government working. So that's also an interesting thing that comes up a lot in debate when talking about who gets to make decisions, how much parties are willing to be influenced, because usually parties are way more easily influenced if they're worried about needing the support of another party immediately, as opposed to waiting for an election in 3 years, etc. Okay, so something that is influenced a lot by the electoral system, and that also influences the electoral system, is first of all, the different political strategies that political parties use. So get out the vote just refers to political parties trying to motivate people to go out and vote for them. Oftentimes these are people they've already identified as their supporters, so they've knocked on doors, made phone calls, and checked who supports them, for example. That's often a priority, particularly if there's like a two-party system or just a few major parties that are trying to make sure that they narrowly beat out on the other party that might be in direct competition with them. But this is an approach that most political parties would use, regardless of size. It just becomes the more determining factor, for example, in the United States, when you're trying to hit that majority. Bringing in non-voters can be a priority or less of a priority, depending on what you're trying to do. So if you're a small party that's trying to form its own niche against more established parties, it might be more important for you to try to bring out people who haven't yet voted, because other voters might be pretty committed, especially if they're, say, strategic voters. Other times it might be less of a priority if you're mostly trying to just captivate the base and you know you have the numbers, you just have to make sure they turn out to vote. Another strategy is bringing in other parties' voters. So this is discussed a lot. How much are voters likely to change parties? This varies tremendously depending on the country. There are some countries where most voters are almost always willing to change parties depending on the leader, who their local elected representative is, the policies that are being presented. Whereas in other countries, especially say two-party systems in which there are just a handful of established parties, countries in which there are ethnic or religious divisions between parties, there might be a lot less fluctuation of voters between parties. So that strategy will change a lot. Another one is dissuading turnout. So running negative campaign ads can be more or less useful depending on what electoral system you have. So, for example, if you're in a system that has a bunch of different political parties, dissuading a specific political party's voters from turning out might not be that useful to make sure that you capture a good percentage of the seats. Whereas if you have two parties, or if there's a country with a lot of strategic voting, dissuading the other party's voters from turning out by running negative ad campaigns, or by stopping their turnout in other ways, for example, legislation that limits people's ability to vote or that requires stringent criteria for IDs to be able to vote, you might have a larger incentive to do those things. Lastly, gerrymandering, which I explained before, you obviously have a bigger incentive to do that if you're in a plurality system, if you're in a system that only has a handful of parties that tend to be prominent, etc. The last thing I want to flag under this, going back to the idea of coalitions, which can even happen in plurality systems, but there's just more variety between majority and minority governments, is coalitions are not always intuitive. So it's really easy for people to make arguments that left-wing parties will stick together and right-wing parties will stick together, whatever that means in your given country. But it's important to note that that's not always how people align, and people's second choices or the parties they affiliate with more aren't always that clear-cut. There may be ethnic or religious divides between parties where people are more likely to group up with political parties that have more similar interests that way. There may be issues that aren't just left-right issues that may group people together or make them more likely to form coalitions. There also might be, for example, separatist movements or regional issues that are more important to a lot of parties than simply where they fall on the political spectrum. So it's always important to identify that depending on the country you're debating about or the system you're debating about. Okay, a few other quick things I want to flag. So corruption, the potential for corruption, often influences what political strategies are preferred. They also depend a lot on the restrictions, which I'll get into later. The use of populism can also be influenced by electoral strategies. That's not to say that populism and kind of populist rhetoric that tries to appeal to people, say that you're speaking for the people, that you're their representative, that institutions aren't doing a good job and that you need to kind of reform them, etc. They can happen anywhere, but I would definitely say that depending on your political system, that might be an easier or more difficult way to capture more of the vote, right? So if you're trying to break into a political system, using populism might be useful because you can berate the establishment, berate existing institutions, say they're not representative, say they're not doing their jobs, and people might really get behind that. Similarly, if you're in a two-party system, a way to co-opt part of that party system, which we've seen a lot in the United States, is to use more populist rhetoric, even if it's within one of the two parties or the two main parties. Another concept I just wanted to flag was what is called the Overton Window, which is basically just the range of ideas that are deemed to be reasonable or mainstream within a society. So obviously that can shift over time, and shifting the Overton window is often a political strategy. So this is often what people talk about when they talk about Bernie Sanders normalizing socialism in the United States, whatever that means to people. That's an attempt to shift the Overton window so that more policies that he agrees with or that he thinks are important become more mainstream, discussed, and more palatable to more voters over time. But similarly, the Overton window will also restrict what political strategies are used. So if you live in a country where people think that X issue is really outside of the mainstream, they might not run on that issue. And that is likely more a problem in pluralist strategic voting societies because they're more worried about kind of being left behind and excluded by the voters. Whereas if you have more political parties, maybe reaching outside that Overton window will capture a specific audience that you think will actually garner you support. So that strategy can vary a lot. Restrictions, so legislation, for example, also both influence political strategy and are influenced by the political system that exists. So campaigning restrictions on who can advertise, what you can do in your advertising, restrictions on how much you can donate are huge. in terms of influencing political strategies and political systems. It's also probably easier to get some of those reforms if you live in a multi-party system that have less majority governments, because you probably have smaller parties that will try to leverage their role in, say, a coalition in order to get restrictions of donations that give them a more equal playing field against larger parties. The banning of political parties or extremist parties, for example. Similar in the media, having equal media time for different parties, having anti-speech hate speech laws, all of that can also influence political strategies that are used in which political parties are prominent. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is the debate topics that exist and how the stuff I just talked about applies to those debate topics. Okay, so the first most intuitive one is debate topics that are actually about electoral systems explicitly. So preferring one system to another, changing the system in the country that you're in, etc. Those come up occasionally. I think they're interesting, and hopefully this will help you debate them a little bit better and a little bit more substantially. But I think probably a larger swath of debate topics are ones that talk about voting behavior, voting systems, etc. So two examples I had found relatively recently was one that was at WUDC 2017, which was, this House believes that the Netherlands should allow citizens to purchase additional votes from the government at a cost proportional to their wealth. So this topic had an info slide about the system in the Netherlands, which is a list proportional representation system. That's probably quite important if you think about it in terms of making sure that this actually makes sense, right? Because it would change a lot if you were implementing this type of policy, for example, in the United States. I also should flag on the side that when I'm talking about the United States, I'm mostly talking about the legislatures elections, so the Congress and Senate. Their presidential system is a little bit different because it's an electoral college system, but it reflects what I had talked about earlier in terms of being more reflective of different states being represented and isn't very proportional isn't very proportional to the number of citizens voting in different places. That's a little bit of a sidebar. But you can see pretty instinctively how this motion would change a lot depending on the country it's from. The second one was from WUDC 2018, which was, this House would allow citizens to vote on individual bills in place of their elected representative, with the representative retaining the voting power of those of their constituents who did not directly vote on that specific bill. This, to my knowledge, did not have an info slide, but I think having an understanding of how elected representatives work in different places is really important, because if you're in a place with list proportional representation, this motion wouldn't actually make a lot of sense if you think about it, because who would be the citizens voting in that constituency, right? So having constituents in that way, I should say some might, that doesn't mean all list proportional representation wouldn't work for this. But for example, ones in which they don't have elected district representatives. So in that sense, that you would kind of need to have different districts or different constituencies to know what percentage voted and didn't in that constituency. It's also quite interesting because it means that if you are in a country that only has 2 or 3 prominent political parties, say 2 political parties support this bill and one doesn't, and the other one, the one that doesn't, has like 60% of seats. You as a social movement or a lobby group or whoever who is trying to get this bill passed would only have to target 10 to 15% of the majority party and get people to vote for the bill in those constituencies if the other 2 parties were already voting for your bill. So it does change the ability for you to impact things, and knowing a little bit about how that system works, how constituents work, plurality versus more representative systems, can influence the way that you make the argumentation a little bit more nuanced. obviously in a round like this, you wouldn't spend too much time explaining the different systems and going through all of them, but having that background knowledge can make sure that you're making an argument that is a little bit more solid and a little bit more believable. I also think that what I just talked about applies to broader topics about politicians and electoral behavior. So there are a lot of arguments about the left, the shift to the left of the United States Democratic Party, which I think reflects a lot, knowing kind of how that democratic system works, how it's mostly two parties, at least on a national level, how it might be easier to swing individual constituencies, even if you can't swing an entire presidential election. So for example, the Democratic Socialists of America have been able to get people elected in specific constituencies that can be helpful for passing votes and passing legislation, even if they don't have a majority. Another one is the left should focus on using class instead of other aspects of identity. So it can be useful to know what kind of organizing occurs, how many districts or ridings you can swing in that way, and kind of other ideas about electoral systems and political organizing as well. So getting out the vote, the amount of people who are likely to be on board and why that's important, etc. And even emotions that are about, for example, the rise of non-career politicians, which can seem kind of far removed, I think having interesting argumentation about the types of things that a non-career politician might prioritize, the reforms, their ability to break into different political systems, and what they might do is very interesting if you have a little bit more background on political systems and electoral systems, particularly on political strategy in the case of this specific motion. So I hope that was a little bit helpful. I would encourage anybody who has questions or is really interested in this and just wants to learn more to email me or message me on Facebook. That's my email and my name on Facebook. Even if I don't accept your friend request, if you send me a message, I should see it in my requests. So I hope that was useful. I hope for those going to the tournament this weekend that you have a really good time. And thank you. Now I had to figure out how to turn this off. Bye.